back from that. And Scott Walker is a very interesting guy. He was born in 1943. He is an American, but he moved to Britain in the 60s and actually ended up becoming a British citizen and lived there his whole life. He has a very interesting early career and this is the only Scott Walker album we're covering, so I'll go a little bit more in depth on the background biography section because I think it's worth noting for him. He went to California at one point as a teenager. Went to art school, broke into the music industry and was a session guitarist at one point, a session bass player, in fact. And he also became somewhat of a teen idol in the music industry at some early hits when I think as early as like 14 or 15 or something to that effect.
Like pop hits?
Yeah. Like they...
Leif Garrett?
And then something to that effect. And then later on in the 60s, in 65, he moved to the UK with his band, the Walker Brothers. And they were neither brothers nor nobody actually had the last name of Walker. So they just, they completely fabricated that. And so moving to Britain in 65, he became part of the British invasion movement, and all of his success came, or his highest amount of popularity came in Britain. From what I can tell, he didn't really cross over into the U.S. He had kind of a unique sound. When he was with the Walker Brothers, he had his signature sound, baritone sound, crooner type of voice, and that's kind of what the music the Walker Brothers did, and they had a lot of hits in the UK. And then he decided to split with the group in 1967 and go solo. And then his first 4 albums in the UK were top 10 hits. And then this album came along, Scott 4, and it failed commercially and kind of led to his reevaluating of his career and kind of some fallow periods before he reinvented himself again. I'll come back to that in a little minute. But his first 3 solo albums had a mix of originals and covers. He's very much, as you can hear on this album, he's very much like a crooner type of a singer. I classify him almost as kind of like a lounge act singer. That's kind of what brings to mind when I hear him sing. And that's really what his manager and kind of the label and marketing team wanted him to be, almost like a UK Sinatra or Tom Jones or somebody like that, somebody who can, swoon the ladies and just have a really, like, I think they kept calling it in articles I read, like middle of the road sound, MOR, like accessible to a wide audience.
Josh, if you don't mind, you said his other albums were commercially successful in Britain, but this one wasn't? Were those other ones drastically different in terms of their sound, or what was the difference there, do you think?
So this album, Scott 4, was his first album of original material, all original material. His first 4 albums were a mix of covers and original songs, and his 4th album. So to backtrack a little bit, he had 3 albums in 1969, and this is the 3rd one that came out. So, and he was popular enough in the UK that one of those albums, he had his own TV show where he would basically, on the BBC, where he would sing songs, and one of those albums is basically material from those shows. Those shows don't exist anymore, or very little footage of that remains. The BBC is infamous for taping over their recordings and not archiving things back then. That's why a lot of Doctor Who stuff is gone forever for sci-fi fans out there. But so there's really no good explanation as to why this album failed and why people didn't like it, or why it didn't crack the top 10. There's different things. It was originally marketed under his real name, Scott Engel. So maybe that had something to do with it, although I'm suspect of that. He said, I watched a documentary about his life. He died in 2019, by the way. But the documentary was from 2006, and it's called Scott Walker, 30th Century Man. And that gave a nice overview of his career and helped me appreciate him a lot. And you get to, I'll get to this too, but you get to see a lot of the artists that really liked him and were influenced by him. And he thought in that documentary that it was because that there was just too much, what did he say? I think he said that there was too much like saturation, or it wasn't marketed the right way or something. He's very, I get the sense that he's very much, he takes responsibility for everything, and he doesn't place blame on other people. So he admits, although, commercially it wasn't successful, critically, and now in retrospect, it's often considered like his best album, which is why I think that, why it's on this list, primarily. Once you go into the 70s, he kind of just did stuff for the label. He was trying to get out of his contract, and then he went like full like David Lynch in the 80s and started making like avant-garde, like industrial type of music, and like did crazy projects with filmmakers and artists, and was making all sorts of even more extreme out there music. What else was I going to say? One of the getting to the numbering on his albums. So one of his big influences was Jacques Brel. He was a Belgian singer-songwriter who was popular in France. And the best way I can describe him is what you think of French music sounding like. This like French singer who it just sounds very like Francophile, but his lyrics were very kind of like subversive and naughty, for lack of a better word. And so I think that's where the influence comes. And Jacques Brel had his albums numbered, like Jacques 1, 2, 3, up to like 8 at one point. And while I didn't read that as a specific reason why his were numbered that way, I can't believe that as such a big influence as he was, that he didn't want to name his albums like that, for that reason. And the other thing about Scott 4 is right before making this album, he had fired his longtime manager, who was attempting to steer him more into the British standard singer like a Sinatra. And I think he, as you can hear on this album, he's his own dude, and I think he wanted to go more do his own thing. So that's a little bit of history. I think the main, let's throw it up to you guys since I've been talking for a little while. John, what did you think about this album?
So I'm familiar with Scott Walker, interestingly enough, because of when he passed away last year. I was reading a blurb, and I found out that David Bowie, Brian Eno, and Tom York of Radiohead in particular were effusive in their praise of him, which stood out to me because I said, wow, that's three very influential performers in their own right. So it actually, I began listening to him, and I started in the mid-90s. And you mentioned David Lynch. And, and the first time so I don't want to go too far off, but let's just say that the stuff he was making in the 1990s sounds nothing like Scott 4. So I'll start by saying that. But the interesting thing that does stand out is that the first time I listened to Scott 4, I listened to it during the day. And that was one type of listen. And the second time I listened to it was at night in an outdoor environment. And it's a totally different listen depending on what the ambiance is around you. And in that sense, there's like an eerie quality to it that does stand out from this album and carry all the way through the like mid-90s stuff, which sounds like a like a David Lynch. David Lynchian would be a really good way to describe. Maybe a little bit of what Bowie and like Trent Reznor were trying to do in the 90s too. Would be another good way to describe it. I'm sure Trent Reznor, I don't know, but I'm sure he's another guy that could appreciate what Scott Walker was trying to do. As an album itself, it is the hardest album we've done for me to weigh in on because there's elements of it I really like, that the tone of the album, the way it's produced are both excellent, and then there's times, like Josh said, that it's like a crooner album. And I think it all depends on the context that you're listening to this album in. And what really stood out to me was I heard it at 2 different times of the day in 2 different landscapes, and it was a totally different listen both times, which is rare for me when I'm listening to albums for this podcast. So I don't even know, and I'm jumping ahead of myself, I don't even know if I would recommend or not recommend this album. It's definitely interesting. It definitely isn't bad, but I would say it is all where your headspace is in terms of how you'll process this. So there you go.
It's such a confluence of different interests. Another thing that he was interested in was like Gregorian chant.
Yep.
And you can hear that in here. He's really kind of an enigma in some ways because you have like a traditional like crooner sound mixed with these big like strings and orchestral and like rich production sounds, and then you have like the first song, which is the Seventh Seal, about an Ingmar Bergman film about death and existentialism.
Well, and the lyrics are really political and almost read like a book. It's like they're not like traditional music lyrics. They're like you mentioned before, talking about like neo-Stalinist regimes, in Czechoslovakia, and apocalyptic themes at different times. And it doesn't. The music can be eerie at times, but it's not eerie in the way that the lyrics would make you feel unsettled. It's like eerie in a different way. So it doesn't always line up, but it's interesting.
Yeah. Matt, what about you? What are your thoughts on this?
So my overall listening experience with this, first of all, I knew nothing about Scott Walker beforehand, so this was all brand new to me. Didn't know any of that stuff that you had mentioned about his bio or just any of his. Never heard of him. Was very surprised. Like, what is this? But the listening experience I found very similar to when we had Tim Buckley's Goodbye and Hello, in that there are songs on here that I think I really like, and there are songs on here that I really dislike, and there's songs in the middle. So 2 artists that I didn't really know a whole lot about, and so I thought that was interesting. I thought it kicked off. I really was intrigued by the opening track, The Seventh Seal. It's like this cool Spanish feel. It's like this trumpet, like classical guitar playing. It's almost like there's like it's like a Western again, right? And it's like a showdown, like we're gonna whatever, draw our guns, right? And have a showdown. Yep. So I thought that was a really cool song. The next 4 songs for me were borderline unlistenable. It was just these very boring, meandering, slow. He sounds like a lounge singer. And I was just going, and I'm listening to it thinking, how is this on? What am I missing? Like, what is this doing on this list? And it's not until you get to, what is it, the 6th song, Hero of the War, which I just looked, and that's the beginning of the second side. you get a breath of fresh air. You've got some guitar in there. I'm not a huge fan of that song, but it's more upbeat. It's got a little bit more pep to it, and it's a little bit more in my wheelhouse because there's a guitar in it, right? And I think it ends very strongly. I think the two of the best songs, along with because like I said, I really like Seventh Seal, but I think Get Behind Me. I love the chorus of that. It's got a great, great chorus. Very. It's catchy. It's very soaring. It's just it stood out to me. And the rhymes of Goodbye. It's more of there's a little bit of a country feeling with that too. It's a little bit of a waltz. And I thought that those were two good tunes. Duchess, Old Man's Back Again, and Hero of the War were decent. Overall, for me, I definitely like the second side of this better, and I'm glad he veered away. I don't know what was happening to those four songs. They all blended in together for me, and I was just very perplexed. And so like John, I don't know if I could recommend the album. I think that, like Tim Buckley, I would recommend certain songs on here, but I don't know about the other stuff. Just really turned me off. So it's in the middle for me.
When I agree, go ahead. Sorry, Josh. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you bring up a good point about the front half. If you think of this as an LP, the front half of the album versus the back half, and how I think I agree that the back half is way stronger, and way, a different tone and different feel than the front half of the album. What were you going to say?
Well, I think even in my notes, I say tracks 2 through 5 are a slog. So, Matt, you and I are on the same page. I don't even really love the Seventh Seal, to be quite honest. I felt it was like a little bit overly long and gimmicky. Yeah. But tracks 6 through 10, on the other hand, are excellent. And I think here's where you mentioned Tim Buckley, and I totally get that, because it's the singer-songwriter breaking away, an inconsistent album. But I cannot stress enough, the vibe of this album, Tim Buckley is like as far away as you can get from the vibe of this album. So like while they're both singer-songwriters, like Scott Walker, in 6 through 10, that's where the songs get very esoteric. That's where the lyrics change very much into grandiose ideas. And there's the song Duchess, for example, is, I think, a beautiful song. And it's interesting because tracks 8 through 10, in my opinion, are the most interesting tracks on the album. And then 7, The Old Man's Back Again, might be the most catchy song on the album. So when you're going through 7 through 10 and you're getting something thrown like that at you, and even the instrumentation is different.
That's a funky bass line in The Old Man's Back Again, isn't it?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's like it's basically like almost like a funk bass line in the background. And then Duchess has something that sounds like a triangle almost, and like intricate musicianship in it. Side B is just a really interesting album that if you like stuff out off the beaten path, I think you'll really like it. But I would agree, it's night and day. Side A is what makes me not comfortable recommending this, and side B is what would make me comfortable recommending this to, and I'll put this caveat, to the musically ambitious.
Yeah. I mean, I can't think of another song that explicitly talks about a movie as the way that Seventh Seal does. It's basically a recitation of the whole story of Seventh Seal, which I find really interesting, and I like that movie. But I mean, there's a lot of religious imagery on this album, devils and angels and gods. That, like John said, the Hero of the War is a really strong anti-war song. So you have this like upbeat musically, but then you have like scathing lyrics like "show his medals to everyone. Too bad he can't shake hands or move his feet."
Yep.
And all about, and that song goes on too about the mother and all of that, and listening to lyrics really was rewarding on this listen. I mean, the album was a commercial flop, so maybe that had something to do with, no strong front side. I don't know about that, but it was so bad. I read that it was deleted, which means it was removed from the label's catalog, so it went out of print on
wow.
purpose. They had him. It was removed.
Blackballed him.
Yeah, and then this made him reevaluate his career, and then he went through, like I said, and did just kind of stuff. The label wanted him to make more commercial music, and so it's weird. Like I said, there's this dichotomy on this album where you have these traditional crooning type of he has an amazing voice, but he has this traditional like crooner voice mixed with all these lyrics and like dark themes and weird imagery. He definitely steers into that later in his life.
But I didn't even mind so much like the fact that the crooning, the slower pace. Like John brings up a good point. Duchess is a very good song, and and I was definitely attracted to that. So, but the other songs on that first side, they're slow, but they're just, I don't know, there's nothing to them, I don't mind a song being slower if you're going to do a crooning kind of style, but there's got to be substance there. And I was really I listened to this album several times, and the other songs grew on me. I find myself picking things out more, in appreciating things more, and say, because initially I was like, I'm going to hate this whole thing, like I was very negative upon the first listen. But those ones really just, I don't see it. I really tried, and I don't know what he's trying to do there. So I'm interested to see, I don't know if, Josh, if you came across reviews of this or whatever, or maybe reviews that were done in hindsight, but was there any mention of that at all? Like, are those songs seen as being, either influential or being important as well as the other ones, as far as you know?
I saw... Not specifically. I did see one article mention the kind of the split of the album and how they responded to the back half more. I think it's more influential, not necessarily this album, but more like his vibe and his aesthetic, and how kind of out there he was.
I mean, the vibe and the aesthetic lines up with David Bowie and Brian Eno for sure. I mean, if I had not even known that they were fans of his, I would have known that this is and for that matter, and for as much a Radiohead fan as you are, Matt, I'm shocked that you don't see how Tom York would be all up in this, because this sounds a lot like his solo stuff at times at the back end of it, in my opinion. So you may disagree with me on that.
I'd have to go back and listen to it. That did not cross my mind.
That's very interesting, because it was very much at the forefront.
Solo stuff is very, I don't know. It's so electronic. And I don't really gravitate towards his solo stuff, so I haven't listened to it a ton. So maybe, but I didn't get that.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say Bowie was a producer on that documentary, and he's interviewed in that, as well as members of Radiohead, Johnny Marr's in there talking about that. Jarvis Cocker was another guy who said was influenced by him, and the Cocteau Twins too.
Yeah, we Jarvis Cocker of Pulp, you could see that. Johnny Marr, the Smiths, you can see both a little bit of what he was doing, but also Morrissey. I mean, his croon. It's so. I mean, you do. I think it was interesting when you said he's a guy from like America as a British guy, because he does Ohio. Sound very quintessentially British. And basically everybody we've mentioned there is British who was influenced by him. And he has a very British ethos to him that it's just interesting that he was able to put that out there as a guy from Ohio.
Yeah, for whatever reason, he really, glommed onto the UK, like you said, ethos or ideology or whatever the vibe is over there, and people responded to that.
So I really wish I hadn't known about Scott Walker before this, because I would have loved to have sounded smarter than I was, right, in saying how much he sounded like David Bowie, and then have you say, he was or Brian Eno, he liked it too. Because I really do think if you don't know anything about Scott Walker, this might be where me and Matt disagree. I don't see how you're not going to see how these guys weren't influenced by his vibe, because you can see some of what he's doing in this album, and other people took it and ran with it. But if you're going off of an artist as a performer, right, and a feel, then you can see what would have drawn these people to him.
I see the Bowie. I see the Bowie. I don't really know Brian Eno, so I can't comment on that. I don't really.
You'll get to know Brian Eno real well in the 70s.
Right on. Let's do it. But yeah, it's just so I just have mixed feelings about it. It's cool to kind of be made aware of stuff like this, just to increase your knowledge base. But it was definitely, it stood out more that just the different feels that I got off of the different, side A versus side B. But I would be interested in, kind of, it sounds like he started going in different directions later on too. So I think listening to this would be a different experience than listening to, some of his other stuff. So, he's definitely interesting. It's not just like Tim Buckley. I know I keep comparing them, but it's not so much because of their. I think, these are exactly the same types of sounds, but it's a similar feel that I'm getting and similar reaction to, the experience I had listening to it, and just the fact that they were doing, it sounds like, I know Tim Buckley did a bunch of different things, and it sounds like he was doing that as well later on in his career. I'm familiar with Buckley stuff. I wasn't too into it, but I'd be interested in hearing more, or what he did, what Scott Walker did later on as well.
Josh, can I do a couple lyric reads? I know you guys hate it, but some people who listen do love it. And I think Scott Walker's a really interesting lyricist. And I think so from Hero of the War, this gives you, as you mentioned, that it's some of these songs are strongly worded. And I said before, it's almost like reading a book at times in terms of how he writes. So from that one, he's a hero of the war. Like his dad, he gave his life the war before. It was tragic how you almost died of pain when he was born. With no husband there beside you through it all, ring the bell if you get hungry or you fall. I mean, that's some stark stuff. And you also have to hear that song to the music that's playing behind it, because it isn't scored the way that you would think those lyrics would be scored. And then it's also being crooned. So it's kind of, and not even like a croon like a Morrissey, where it can go into like a somber croon at times and an upbeat croon at times and a sad croon. It's kind of like a flat croon where he never really goes anything like this. It's like that all the time, right? That type of singing. And then in Duchess, it's a love song theoretically, but he writes it as, with the Persian sea running through your veins, you shed your names with the seasons, still they all return with the last remains, and they lay them before you like reasons, which is it sounds great what he does at the end, and it's also deeper than the average word salad that you get from a lot of folks. And so it's just really, he even has a lyric, and that's, with your shimmering dress, it says no, it says yes, which is a very interesting way of expressing desire, and sort of like almost like a carnal desire, but not in a way that's, overt or off-putting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, his lyrics, and I mean, the Old Man's Back Again is about Czechoslovakia and Stalin, and as well. So
it's very dark, and it's very much like you're going to die and your sacrifice is going to be lost in the machinery that is
it's also
grinding communism. Yeah.
It's also described, the genre on Wikipedia describes this genre as Baroque Pop.
Yeah.
I was like, that's a thing? Baroque Pop? I missed out on that one, that movement.
Well, but it does sound like it's a classically scored album at times. And that, once again, I keep going back to people that brought that sort of ethos to music, right? A lot of the people we've mentioned who are fans of Scott Walker, I think in some ways view themselves as composers in the way that, like, you make classical music. And that's clearly what I think Scott Walker was going for here a little bit. So, yep. So that's my end take right there. I would recommend to anyone listening, if you like interesting music, I can't guarantee you'll like it, but listen to it, and listen to it twice. And in my opinion, listen to the second half of the album at night, because it really is it's a great late evening album. It creeps up on you, and it sneaks up on you. And that's, to me, that's always a good thing.
Yeah, he's a really unique individual, and at the very least, I think this will lay the groundwork for future artists that we listen to, and we can call back on this down the road.
I'd say I'd recommend it, but I'd say listen to track 1 and then skip to track 6. Don't even bother. So, but yeah, interesting. it's enough for me to want to try to listen to some other stuff that he's done.